Last week, we were looking at a passage from chapter 8 where Jesus was asking the disciples, who do people say that I am? And eventually, Peter gets around to saying, well, you're the Messiah, you're the Christ. And of course, what we talked about was Peter has no idea what that means because the meaning of being the Christ is the one who goes to the cross. And when Jesus starts to talk about that, Peter says, oh no, you're not going to do that. And so Jesus was having trouble getting his disciples to realize that what it means to be the Messiah is to be the one who reveals the self-offering love of God by dying on the cross. That's what he is to do in order to teach us and show us in a kind of an astounding way that the Father truly loves us without limit. Well, here in chapter 9, it seems like he's continuing to do that, and I think the reason he doesn't want anyone else to know about it, he's trying to spend some intentional time just with the disciples, trying to get this point across, right? Because obviously they missed it last time when they talked about it a little bit earlier. And so now it's just Jesus and the disciples, and he's trying again to talk to them in verse 31 about how he will be delivered, it says, into the hands of men. They will kill him, and when he has been killed, he will rise 3 days later. Verse 32 says, but they did not understand this statement. I think maybe the statement they didn't understand is what this rising means. I mean, they heard clearly in chapter 8 that he was going to die. That's when Peter said, no, don't let that happen. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. You really don't understand the ways of God. You have in mind your own thoughts. So the statement I think they don't understand is what this reference to a resurrection means, and how could they? We can certainly give them a pass by saying, how could they really understand what it would mean? How could they expect? They don't expect his death, but what are they to make of this talk about rising again? So they didn't understand it, but Jesus is trying to teach them. Now they get to Capernaum. That's where Jesus and Mary live. That's where Peter and some of the other disciples live. Jesus and Mary are living in Capernaum after having moved from Nazareth. And they get there and they go into the house. This is probably, most likely, Peter's house, because we know Peter's married, and probably the child that Jesus takes in his arms is Peter's child. They're probably in Peter's home. And they're having just, they've not letting anyone else know. They don't want all the crowds. Jesus is just trying to talk to his disciples about what he needs to get them to understand about his own messiahship, being the anointed one. So they go into this house in Capernaum, and he begins to question them, verse 33, what were you discussing on the way? Now, I think he knows what they were discussing. I don't think it takes some sort of, miraculous power for him to have read their minds or something. I think the discussion was probably somewhat animated. He heard snippets of it. He knew what they were talking about. So the question is somewhat rhetorical, right? He's not asking because he doesn't know. He's asking because he wants to talk about what he knows they've been talking about. So what were you talking about? And they don't want to say, which is a sign of what? Guilt, right? They know enough about what Jesus is about that their discussion is out of line with what Jesus wants from them. Isn't that interesting? I mean, that's true of me so many times. I mean, I know what Jesus wants, and lots of times I still go ahead and work on my own agenda. And that's what they've been doing. They've been talking about who's greatest, but when he says, what have you been talking about? They all kind of sheepishly know, well, we shouldn't have been discussing that. He's not going to be pleased with that. Nobody wants to fess up and say what they were talking about, but they're doing it anyway. They're not really embracing what Jesus is about because while they know he won't be pleased, they're still having these discussions, trying to plan how each one of them might aspire to be greater. So then we have Jesus knowing what they talked about. He says, in verse 35, sitting down, which is probably a sign of he intends to teach, right? The rabbis in the synagogue sat down. It's part of the reason I like to sit when I speak. One is I'm not trying to give an animated lecture where I'm, prancing back and forth around and doing gestures and just trying to sit and teach, right? A little bit like, to me, what Jesus would have done. So I think when it says he sits down, okay, it's like, fellas, we're going to talk. Let's talk. I'm going to sit down and you have a seat and we need to talk about this. And the essence of what he teaches, I don't know that these are all the words. It's a synopsis. But the essence of what he teaches, it says in 35, sitting down, he called the 12 and said to them, if anyone wants to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. That's the essence of what he conveys. Now, he may have done so in many more words than this, but that's the core of what he's teaching. That's the teaching itself. How do you think they heard that? I can think of several possibilities. They could have heard it as a technique, which would probably be the worst way to hear it, right? Okay, you guys want to be greatest? Here, I'll give you the technique and how to be greatest. So keep your same desires for self-promotion. I'm just telling you how you actually ought to go about promoting yourself. It's by being a servant for the alternative agenda of actually being great, right? It could have been heard that way. Don't know if they heard it that way. But we could hear it as, a technique. Your desires aren't incorrect. You just don't know how to go about doing it. Here, let me tell you how. But I don't think that's what he's doing. I think he's questioning their desires. A second way you could hear it is kind of like punishment. If you want to be first, I'm going to put you at the end of the line and punish you for wanting to be first, right? This is a punishment. Like if any of you aspire to this again, I'm telling you, I'm going to put you right at the end, right? And they could have said, okay, we won't do it again, or at least let you know, right? Because we don't want to get in trouble, and it's a punishment. But I don't think it's a punishment. I think it's a spiritual discipline. And that's different. That's different. Because our spiritual disciplines are an attempt for us to deal with what we know we need to work on. Right? Evagrius of Ponticus, many years ago, back in the late 300s, he talked about these deadly obsessive thoughts that later in the life of the church became known as the 7 deadly sins. He actually talked about 8 obsessive thoughts, deadly thoughts that we get rolling around in our heads. And he identified those as very, very much kind of core problems we deal with. Things like greed, like pride, like anger. And he really delved into what are these things and how do they function? And greed, he said, is that sense that I'm afraid about the future. I don't know if there'll be enough, so I need to amass all I can now as a kind of hedge against future deprivation. It may be scarce in the future. And he identifies greed as a problem of trusting in God's provision, which evidently, if you look at it, it is. If that's why I need more and more, kind of an insatiable desire for I've got to have more, is it because I really don't trust that God will provide what I need in due time? But also something Evagrius did was he gave a corresponding virtue to cultivate which would work on your problem if you have this obsessive thought of greed. And for greed, the virtue was generosity, right? Then you need to practice being generous. Find ways and places to be generous so that you can start realizing that God is providing and you can be providing. And that was your antidote. That was the remedy to greed. And so you were to employ it as a spiritual discipline, where you're trying to cultivate a different virtue against that vice. against the sinful temptation to be greedy or to be angry or to be prideful. We were to cultivate something like humility instead of pride, calmness and serenity instead of anger. And they were deliberate attempts to engage in the practice of developing a virtue. So I really think what Jesus is recommending here is not a technique and how to actually be great. He's not telling them they're going to be punished for wanting to be great and put at the end of the line. No, he's giving them what they need to do to deal with the fact that their desires right now are for greatness. And so what he's saying is you need to practice being last, to rid yourself of this thought, I need to be great. You need to practice putting yourself at the end of the line. And do that until it dissipates your desire for self-promotion, to be someone. St. John Chrysostom, Bishop of Constantinople, in his sermon on this passage said, if you are in love with precedence and the highest honor, pursue the things in last place. Pursue being the least valued of all. Pursue being the lowliest of all. Pursue being the smallest of all. Pursue placing yourselves behind others. And that's how he's reading it. This is the remedy to what is your spiritual illness. And it's very practical. You're going to have to do something. I would love it if all my spiritual maladies were removed by, kind of the miraculous intervention of God. Snap your fingers and it's gone. In AA, they call that the softer, easier way. Nobody wants to work a program of sobriety. They just want to be cured of their alcoholism, right? But that's not how it happens. And that's not how it happens with any spiritual problem. We have to intentionally engage in the practices that will then bring healing. It doesn't mean that we're saying we're doing it ourselves. The grace of God enters in the midst of our spiritual disciplines. My spiritual disciplines, when I put myself in a place where I'm practicing something, I'm doing it with my full attention to how God, through his grace, through the working of the Spirit, can transform me in the midst of this. It's not a belief that I can change my own heart. It's a belief that God can change my heart if I put myself in places where my heart can be changed. When I realize my heart is too prideful, then I need to find ways of practicing being humble. And that's kind of what it is that Jesus is addressing here. They want to be first. It's a matter of pride. He says, practice putting yourself in the lowliest of positions. Then my Father can address the pride that lurks in your hearts. It's now that he takes what I think is probably Peter's child, sets him in his lap, embraces him. Verse 36, taking a child, he set him before them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, whoever receives one child like this in my name receives me, and whoever receives me does not receive me, but him who sent me. So if that was the teaching about the spiritual disciplines they needed to intentionally practice in their lives to rid themselves of their constant desire to be greatest, then what is the place of this illustration of the child? Because it's an illustration. He uses the child as an example. Well, there's a lot of things I think that we can notice. One is that the child embodies the kind of lowliness that he's saying they need to practice. Now, this is not the place where he says, become as the child, but by embracing the child, he's embracing one who is not powerful, whose place in social settings, whose standing in the world is not what they're aspiring to. And so to embrace that child is perhaps at least one practical way for them to start putting themselves in a different kind of place. By paying attention to the littlest ones, they're taking their eyes off of their own ambitions for places of prominence. Because if you're looking for places of prominence, you're probably not paying attention to the needs of the children, because you're looking how to maneuver yourself into that position where you can have control, where you can have prominence before others. So there's that part of it. But it's interesting that he says something very specific. He says about the child, when you receive the child, you receive me. And when you receive me, it's not just me, it's my Father, the one who sent me. Now, I take this to be, in some sense, the reward. The remedy is these spiritual practices. The reward is relationship with God. I think that's what it comes down to. And it's relationship with God, not because, well, when I go to temple and the service is going on, I feel really close to God. He's not saying that's not a place where you might feel close to God. He's not saying, well, you can't feel close to God in other circumstances, but he is saying maybe a lot of your relationship with God is going to be expressed and experienced and that reward encountered when you are with someone who is unimportant in this world. It seems like it goes along with the remedy, right? The remedy is doing this, but the reward is inherent within it. If you will pay attention to the least, you will find God. Where is God in the world? Go spend some time with unimportant people, and maybe God will show up. Isn't that kind of what he's saying? You will encounter God. And you will learn to see God in this unimportant, in his case, Peter's child, this unimportant person who holds no authority, who holds no position, who is not important in worldly terms. But here you find God is present. You meet God. And so I think there's a greater principle at work, the one I'm trying to articulate, is this idea of we encounter God in one another, and in particularly those who are of least importance. Now, in some ways, this could give you a real motivation for spending some time with unimportant people, right? Because that's where you develop this relationship with God. This is where you learn how God is present and you encounter God. If I spend all my time seeking to only hobnob with the powerful, with the important, with the influential, maybe Jesus is saying, you're not going to find much of God. Not that God can't be present in those people as well, but if I'm with them for what I could gain from my association with them, I'm probably not very attuned to encountering God. But when I'm spending time with someone who's least, who's last, maybe there I start to find, here God is present. Here's the reward of relationship. Maybe at the end of the day, we might say, the question I have to ask myself is, what do I value? Do I value this kind of relationship with God above all else? Above, as it were, my possible personal status? If I seek the relationship with God, then Jesus says, here's where you can find it. Seek it there. Make yourself last. This comment by Gregory of Nyssa, one of the Cappadocian fathers, again from the 4th century, says, let vanity, in other words, pride, be unknown among you. Let simplicity and harmony and a guileless attitude weld the community together. Let each remind himself or herself that he or she is not only subordinate to the brother or sister at his side, but to all. If he knows this, he will truly be a disciple of Christ. May God lead us to the children in our world. Amen.